Hi, my sweet strangelings. Welcome to Mystic Mondays, and today we're going to be talking about mental health and spirituality. I know at some point one of you guys or all of you guys have had a moment where you wanted to talk to somebody, a therapist or a specialist about our mental health, and sometimes we're afraid to do that for several reasons. We're going to be having a special guest today, and they're going to be talking all about their line of work, debunking the myths of spirituality and therapy, because sometimes people don't think those two things go hand in hand. All right. So, hi, Luis. Thanks for being on the podcast. Can you talk a little bit about your work, how you got started, and everything? I'm like so excited to have you on. I mean, I have so many questions.
Yeah, no, thank you for that great introduction, Stephanie. I appreciate it. And for everyone out there who's listening, my name is Luis Cornejo. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist in the state of California. I am the co-owner of Psychosocial Therapy, a fully virtual practice. It's a group practice where I specialize in queer and BIPOC mental health. I'm also a model, and I have done runways. I have collaborated with different designers. I'm very passionate about representation, especially around queer, Latinx folks, and just folks of color in general. And so modeling has been another avenue of my work in mental health as well. I'm also a speaker and have spoken at lots of different places about the importance of mental health, the power of self-expression, the power of authenticity. And I'm also a podcast host myself for the Queer Magic podcast, which has one season out right now. And I'm currently in the works to plan season two. But yeah, I do a little bit of everything. And I'm so excited to be here and talk about really important topics with you.
Said something that really just touched me just now, where like spoke to me. I mean, like it about beauty and confidence and just like really expression. I don't think we see that enough, I feel like. And I think that also falls in line with mental health, right? Like if you don't see yourself being represented, how can you feel like you belong? How can you feel like you have a space, right?
Absolutely. You're right on it. I mean, the representation is crucial and it's very important for our mental health, right? Because we connect socially to one another. And when we don't see ourselves represented in these spaces, it makes us feel like we don't belong or like we need to be into the same space as other people, right? Fit into molds. And that can actually have a more detrimental effect on our mental health because we're constantly trying to justify our worthiness. And so you're absolutely right. I think it is crucial for us to be able to see ourselves. But even aside from just media, and I just want to touch on this really quick, even
Yeah.
aside from mass media and like all of this other stuff, that we show up as ourselves, right? Because there are other people watching us. And I think for me, one of the best things about doing this work is that others have reached out to me and have said, Louise, watching you has made me feel really good about myself and it's made me want to embrace myself more. And even though I'm still on that journey myself and still navigating a lot of these things, and I will forever, right? Because obviously we live in a world where there's a lot of pushback on being yourself and authentic, and especially for queer folks. So it's an ongoing thing, but I think we can all do our part in that way. And for me, modeling was just another form of that self-expression and to showcase this. So thank you for highlighting that.
Oh my God, I love that. Yeah, it just you're right. I think just like in being ourselves and not allowing ourselves to be boxed in, because being Latino, Latina, Latinidad, like we there's so many people that try to box us in, like unless we're just doing like just gonna use like the Mexican stereotype for this one, but like the mariachi or cumbia, like then it's just all of a sudden like you're not Latino enough or you're not Latina enough. And I just feel like it's so important to just be authentically ourselves, which is why I do what I do. I do paranormal topics. I'm like, no, like we love the supernatural, we love everything, so let's just bring ourselves into that.
I think that's what drew me to your work and your podcast, was to see you out there and like talking about things that we speak about culturally in little ways, but we never outright speak about it, right? Spirituality, even like, I mean, just supernatural, right? Like we
Hmm.
we we have things embedded into our culture, but there's so much shame and stigma because of cultural practices, religion, lots of other factors.
you, speaking of growing up with these things, can you share with the audience your paranormal experiences? What has that been like? And, what on a scale of 1 through 10, how much of a believer are you of the paranormal?
Oh my gosh, where do I even start? This is such an interesting part of my life that I don't think I talk about it to a big extent, mostly because of what I just shared around stigma, right? And shame when it comes to having these kinds of conversations, that there's a lot of people who don't believe, right, in spirits or the supernatural. And so there's often a lot of dismissal about our experiences, or even a lot of avoidance of these topics. And for me, I would say that I'm a pretty big believer, in the sense that I've had experiences that I'm not able to explain, and I have shared with people that I'm very close to, and I love talking about it when people want to listen, because it just feels like there's a validation, right, of these experiences that otherwise feel unexplained. And so for me, I remember the first time anything like this ever happened to me, and it's an interesting story, and I'll share at the end why. But for a long time, I thought I was the only one that remembered this, and so I didn't really talk about it except to like my partner or close friends. And my brother was actually there with me, and we had never talked about it, because I think it was just one of those things where we just like, like, did it happen? Did it not happen? Do we talk about it? Do we not? And it happened during one of our birthdays. So my parents are from Mexico and Guatemala, and birthdays were a big thing for us. We used to celebrate every year, and they'd have this huge party, invite all the neighbors, invite friends, and it was just a big deal. And I remember my brother and I were celebrating our birthdays together, even though mine is in June and his is in August. My parents would like to just make it like one big party, and so we'd celebrate like around July. And I remember we were having this backyard barbecue, like a carne asada, and it was full of people and kids and everything were running around. And we used to love playing games and just kind of like hiding, or just, doing random things like that. And I remember my brother and I, we were chasing each other, and we both ran into our room. And when we ran into our room, we had this like window with like a curtain. My mom always had these really thin white curtains. And as soon as we walked in, I remember seeing a clown standing behind the curtain, smiling with this black hat. And I don't know if I was in shock or if it was just like, that moment, but I remember standing there staring at it and thinking, oh my gosh, is this real? Is this like part of the birthday? What's going on? And my first instinct was like, run. And so I remember just leaving the room and like running out with my brother. And for years and years, I thought, oh my gosh, it must have been a dream, or maybe I just like imagined it, or maybe it was someone was dressed up as a clown. I mean, we didn't have a clown at the party, so I think in my head I was trying to rationalize it. And it wasn't until maybe a couple of years ago when I casually was talking to my brother. We're talking about our birthdays, and I mentioned it out of nowhere, and he's like, wait, you saw that too? And I was like, yes, I was there with you. And he was like, oh my God, I thought it was a dream this whole time. Like I thought that I had like dreamt it. And I sat there with him, and we're looking at each other, and I was like, okay, we couldn't have possibly had the same dream on our birthday. I'm like, that doesn't make sense. And I just remember him like looking at me and being like, oh my God, like I was so scared, and I just didn't talk about it because I thought I had dreamt it, and, didn't put a lot of attention to it. And so after that, I just remember feeling like, oh my gosh, like, yeah, like he was there with me. We saw the same thing, and we both just didn't talk about it. And that was the first time I ever had any type of experience like that. And I don't know about my house. So my parents still live in Inglewood. We were born and raised there, and that house has always been a bit creepy, in the sense that I notice a lot of strange things happen around that area in general. That was my first experience. And after that, I would see a lot of shadows, right? Of like people, right? Thinking that they were people. For example, my neighbor had this really long backyard entrance, and this was all around the same age. And I remember I would walk by there, and I would always see someone standing in the back, and I would think, it's the neighbor. They're probably just outside. And as soon as I would blink, it would be gone. And I think, okay, it's like, are they playing tricks on me? Are they just running away? Little incidents like that. Other moments where my brother and I used to love playing outside, and we would play hide and seek. And so we would hide behind people's cars in their driveway. And I remember one time I was chasing my brother, and I would look under the car to see if I can see where he was moving, because that way I could catch him. And one time I was kind of following around the car, and I just kept seeing him run around. And there was a moment where I looked under and I was just staring. And then he comes up from behind me and he taps me. He's like, "What are you doing?" Like, I was like, "You're taking so long." And I look at him and I look back and there's no one there. And I just remember thinking, like, oh my gosh, who was I like playing around the car with? Who was I following? So those little moments were during my childhood where I often like wondered, like, what was that? Like, what am I seeing? And I remember not being able to talk to my parents about it because they were very religious, and a lot of times when we did mention it, they would allude it to like, oh, the devil, or oh, it's something evil. And so automatically, that fear would kick in and be like, oh my gosh, you can't talk about these things. You shouldn't talk about uh feeling things or seeing things or noticing, odd things, because they're gonna allude it to that. And in my head at that point, as someone that was raised in the church and also was a frequent churchgoer, I believed it. I thought, oh my gosh, this is evil, something bad, temptation, the devil, a demon, whatever, and just kind of brushed it off that way. Like, I need to ignore it and avoid it because it's not good. Um,
Yeah.
so there were a lot of moments like that where instead of really questioning it, I just avoided it. I was like, okay, I shouldn't talk about it. And it did continue when I got older. I started to get sleep paralysis, which I know many of us have experienced before. And it is one of the most terrifying experiences, I have to say. Like, there were moments where I honestly thought, oh my gosh, I'm gone. And, this is it, because you can't move your body. You're also trying to scream. You can't make any sounds. It almost feels like you're in between, this deep sleep and a consciousness. And many people, which I didn't know this until I did my own research because it was happening so constantly, reported that they always felt like someone was in the room with them. And I thought it was just me. I thought, oh my gosh, maybe I'm like half awake, half asleep, and I'm sensing someone here, right? And I'm powerless. And I didn't realize
Yeah.
that it's actually a normal part of that experience. Um, the one time I can remember right now that really took a I guess, left an impression on me, I would say, was when I was in college and my brother, I was with my brother, which is so funny because we were living in the apartment together. We were sharing a room, and he was going to community college and I was at the university. And I remember we had twin beds, and they were kind of like on the opposite side. And there was a moment where I was sleeping in my bed and I got sleep paralysis, and I woke up and it was like 2:30, 3-ish in the morning, and I'm laying there and I can't move. And I start to feel someone breathing next to me. And all I hear is like just like breathing. And I'm like, oh my gosh. So I like start to turn my head, which was the only thing I could do. And I see my brother sleeping in his bed. And I start to try to like scream to him and like call his name. And I can't. And so all I could do at that moment was literally close my eyes. And I just remember tears going down my face. And I started praying and just being like, oh my gosh, please, like, protect me. Don't let this happen to me. And waking up the next morning and just like, almost like, oh my gosh, was that real? Did that happen? And so those were kind of like a little bit of my earlier experiences. And I've had some more.
So the first experience with the birthday and seeing the clown with the hat and everything, and your brother, it's so interesting because I can relate to something like that. I know I mentioned it a few times on here, but basically my sister and we had an experience with something mimicking our other sister's voice when she was not home.
Yeah.
And I always chalked it up to like, oh, it was a prank or whatever. And every time I revisit it with my sister, it just reinforces like, no, something unexplained happened. And till this day, it's been well over 15 years. What the heck? She would have, at this point, she would have said it's a prank, and that's just not her personality. She's more like the serious older sister trope. So,
Yeah,
like,
no, it makes
definitely
you
not.
it,
Oh,
well, it
sorry.
makes a difference, right? When you feel validated or like someone else is there, because then it's almost like, okay, like we did see something, right? Versus when it's more individual. Like I think that's what made that experience so powerful, that we both realized in that moment, like, and he's totally someone that's very opposite of me. So it was almost like, oh my God, like it wasn't just me.
Yeah, and I guess like what I wanted to point out with that experience that you had with like the clown and the hat, and like I guess I want to ask you this question too, because the shadow man or the hat man phenomenon that a lot of people experience is a shadow with the hat, and I guess my question for you is, do you know about the phenomenon, and can you differentiate the clown and the hat man, because there's some similarities there, except that it's a clown.
You know what? No, I don't actually. And it's so interesting because I think part of me wants to really explore and look into a lot of these things, but there's still a lot of that instilled fear and like a lot of anxiety around it for me personally because of religion and the way that I was taught about it. And so I normally kind of went with the idea of just accepting what I
Mm,
saw, or just embracing the fact that, there are other things that are unexplained that exist, and that's it. But I would
yeah.
love to hear more about it, like what you know.
Yeah, because like, okay, so I had one of my best friends also would experience sleep paralysis and also would see shadow people, and he also had an experience like seeing like ghosts. He at this point he's just now claimed it, like it's ghosts that were watching my parents the night that I woke up in the middle of the night and walked down the hallway.
Sure.
Um But with that being said, I recently, not recently, like I want to say, like, not recently, years back, there was this documentary on Netflix about the shadow people phenomenon and the Hat Man, and people around the world experience seeing a shadow figure in the corner of the room with like the Hat Man, like with a hat. And it's the creepiest thing ever because I had no idea this was a thing, and my friend would tell me these stories, and I'm like, there's a documentary. He's like, no way, this is a thing. I'm like, yeah. So it's interesting because you're like talking about this clown and the hat. What kind of hat was it? Was it like a jester hat? Like what kind of hat?
You know what? It was just one of those like limp kind of looking hats with the little ball at the end. You know those kind of like old school
Yes.
clown hat. That's what it was. At least that's what I remember. Um, and he was just standing there. I mean, he had his face was painted white. I always kept thinking that maybe it was related to the fact that at that time it was such a big hit, and I remember watching it and also a movie called Killer Clowns. So I thought in my head maybe that's what I was seeing, right? And from my understanding, when I try to like rationalize that, I read that a lot of times these figures or even spirits can take shapes of things that you're afraid
Yes.
of. And the fact that my brother and I both saw it was kind of what really reinforced my idea that no, I did see this, and it may not have been the actual shape of what it was, but it was presenting itself that way to me because I was terrified at that time of
Oh,
this.
okay.
And obviously, it was in my home. We were watching the movie there. We were talking about it. I mean, there's a lot I think that goes into understanding that spirits are very intelligent forces, and that
Yes.
it's not just like oh, it was an actual clown. Like in my head, I was thinking it took that shape because it knew that's what was scaring us. And so my brother and I both talked about it, like I said, a couple of years ago. And he also remembers being very afraid of clowns at that time. And so the clown was just very old school looking, white face, the little hat with the little fuzzy ball at the end, and just standing there behind the curtain, like staring at us and
Oh.
smiling. That was all I
Okay,
remember.
so then it's not the shadow people, sorry. Because I think I was confusing it for that, and then also your other experience with feeling sleep paralysis. But
Yeah.
even with the clown thing, I recently stumbled upon this segment, or this little piece of like story of Greeley, Colorado, where they call it the clown ghosts, where like basically like these clowns were in a car, but they're performers, they're circus performers, but now they, over time, the name has been changed to clown ghosts, and apparently they suffered a very tragic accident, and people feel like they see these like clowns in at a train station in Greeley,
Yeah.
Colorado. And so it's interesting because you're telling me what you're telling me. I'm like, oh my god, I'm also wondering, did a guy at one point live there that did like performances at parties and was like, invite me to the carne asada, let me do the part. I don't know.
And you know what? Honestly, that makes so much sense to me because and I'm actually not afraid of clowns. Like I don't have a phobia of clowns or anything like that. And it's interesting that even I do love true crime and I love horror, and clowns are always such a big part of these genres, right? And even
Yeah.
we can talk about what's his name, John Wayne Gacy, right, dressing up
Oh,
as a clown.
yes.
I mean, those elements, I think it's just so powerful and interesting. So as you were sharing that, I was thinking like, it's weird because like I remember at that time I was so afraid of them, but it was because of the way they had been presented that as I got older, it wasn't really there. But yet in those moments, right, kind of like seeing this figure behind the curtain, it was terrifying because I was a kid. I was exposed to this version of clowns and then saw this and, the history behind a lot of clowns, at least from my knowledge. And I actually haven't watched the documentary, but I'm interested in watching more around like shadow people and also like around
Yeah.
like clowns and like a lot of the mythology, right? I, never had a history of hallucinations, visual or audio.
So, when in terms of clinically and in your profession, right, in those terms, what does history mean for people to understand? Because having a one-time occurrence is not a history.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a very sensitive subject, obviously, because we do live in a world where, especially in mental health, the medical model is very specific about folks who experience things like auditory or visual hallucinations, right? We talk about schizophrenia, we talk
Mhm.
about a lot of different diagnoses, right, that I could easily list. But the reality is that we still don't really fully understand to the extent of what exactly it means. We know that when we say history, we're talking about maybe folks who have experienced um, these things that are considered hallucinations, right? Visual or audio. Um, and to me, I think that's where it's almost kind of moved me away from that concept that many folks, when they experience this, right? And this is why I say I've done my best to try to create space for people, because a lot of times when you go to therapy, many therapists are trained to, as soon as they hear a lot of these things, to see it as there's something going on, right? This
Mhm.
person has something, some type of condition or whatever. When the reality is that there are people who are very sensitive and who do see or hear very specific things. And I'm a firm believer that, we don't have an explanation for everything. And so I don't jump to a lot of those kinds of assumptions, right? Of, oh my gosh, this is what diagnosis you should have, or oh my gosh, this is what's happening. Instead, I think I'm very curious about people's history. And when I say history, I'm talking about experiences that they've had throughout their life. Right. So there are folks who have shared, I've seen things since I was younger. I've heard voices since I was, this age, and it's been happening constantly, or I hear or see things. And so when we say history, it's really more a timeline, right? When did you start? Did it start like at a certain point? Has it occurred constantly? And all of that is just information that we obviously use to be able to assess and give the appropriate diagnosis, right? If there is one. I'm not saying that people who are schizophrenic are not schizophrenic, because obviously there's going to be folks that are. And yet, what I'm saying is that there's also situations where people are not, and we automatically diagnose because we hear, that they have this connection or this hypersensitivity, and we automatically go, okay, they're schizophrenic because they've been, they've heard or felt things since they were like, this age, or whatever. And so I think, just to clarify, when I say that, obviously it's not as simple to diagnose someone or to even like label or to even like say what someone might be experiencing. It's a process, which is what also makes it challenging. Many of us have not had access to mental health services. Many of us have a family with a history of certain behaviors. For me, I usually consider more of people's safety, right? Are these things putting people at risk for harming themselves, harming others? Rather than folks who I've worked with who have come over to me and said, you know what, I sense these things, right? And there's no instructions or anything around like, that I'm being told to do this. I'm being told. It's really more around like, I see it, I sense it, it scares me. Or sometimes I know it's there. And that's just how it's been, or I
Right.
your grandmother who was curandera, or work with spirits, or from the old world, right? And so there's like a family, almost like tradition, or passed down right around this. And so I think it just really varies.
Thank you for that explanation. I feel like there's a huge distinction. I think we said this off camera, but we
Yeah.
said, when we met at the Clara event, there's two distinct things. There's religious. There's two different types of paranormal categories. There's the religious, and then there's a non. And I've noticed that even in therapy, if it's not religious, then it falls into like, and when I say religious, I mean monotheistic, Abrahamic religion based stuff like Christianity or even Catholic. I feel like those get a lot more respect in a therapy session than if you're saying like, I'm a Wiccan and I do this, or I'm an occultist. At least like through my perception, it
Yeah.
seems like that. Whereas like if you come in and you're like, oh, I don't know, I worship this deity that they don't even know what it is. They're like, okay, this person is a schizophrenic. At least that's the perception I get from it.
Yeah, no, no, I agree. I think that there's definitely a double standard to lots of things, right? We're human, so a lot of therapists also have biases, right? And a big part of the work is challenging and working through those to understand and see people as individuals, and also as someone that is coming in with their own experience. So that has been a part of my work, right? And really re-indigenizing and decolonizing my practice. My work is understanding that culturally, for a lot of us folks of color, we have very different experiences and also talk about things in a very different way. But religion is often, yeah, you're right, is often seen as more acceptable, or seen as more of a rationale, right, for explanations. Like I've had colleagues who might have said, like, "Oh, well, they're religious. They believe in this and that. That makes sense." Blah, blah, blah. I know about that. But then when it comes to, like you were saying, right, the non-religious, oftentimes people have this, oh, it might be anxiety. Oh, it might be schizophrenia. Oh, you're watching too many scary movies. Oh, like maybe you're just imagining things, right? There's always this assumption that because it's not religious, there's no actual explanation. And I think as humans, we like rationality, right? We like to be able to have things that are tangible. And even religion, even though not everyone believes in religion, there's still at least some explanation to like this element of something, like, oh yeah, like, demons. Like that was something that, many of us may not even be religious and we're terrified about it because it's
Yes.
associated with something we know, versus like, oh, a ghost, right? People are like laugh, they
Yeah.
think of Casper, right? Or they make these weird
Yes.
association.
Well, I wanted to add this other thing too, because it's just in case people don't end up watching or listening to the previous episodes. But,
Yeah.
there was something that I pointed out in one of the previous episodes where studies have shown since the 70s, people are becoming more of believers of the paranormal because it's become more nuanced, but but they're becoming less religious. And so what we're noticing is that people are taking elements of paranormal stuff that maybe belong to religion, but because they're no longer religious or their family wasn't religious growing up, it comes from a societal experience and perception of this is paranormal, and that's what's happening. And I think that's why it's so important to have these conversations, especially with you, right? Like in your field, like becoming aware of that, like the paranormal, it people still believe in it, they're just less religious, and it doesn't mean they're like this disorder, like mental health disorder or something of that nature. It just means that society has shifted, and that means
Yeah.
that the paranormal has shifted with it as well.
And that's constantly the case, right? That as society shifts, our beliefs, our views, our perspectives, our things that are acceptable and not change throughout time, depending on society's progress or backwardsness, right? Whatever it is. And religion is really a set of beliefs, right? I mean, it's a cultural practice for many people to believe in something and have an organized version of it, but it's just an explanation, right, around existence. Like we don't have a factual, this is 100% true, right? That's what faith is, right? Believing in something. And so even with religion, it's going to be one version of an explanation of something that humans have experienced forever, right? I think that a therapist, at least in my perspective, who is coming in with the concept of understanding people first versus going based off a manual or going based off a specific recipe for, labeling people, will likely be a lot more curious about how this has shown up for folks, how they experience it culturally, even as a therapist, I can't sit here and say, oh yeah, that's not real. That's not true, because I don't know. I know I've had my experiences. I know many people who've had their experiences. And for me, it's really more about how has this impacted you? How do you cope with this? Or how do you like experience this? And also, what does it mean to you specifically? And does it have an impact on you? Right. Because, like I said, I've had clients who have almost like shocked me in moments where we don't know each other that well. And yet they'll say things that I'm like sitting there like, and I'll give one example. I used to work at a nonprofit in San Francisco, very old nonprofit, and they had this really beautiful building. And I remember when I started to see clients there was one in particular that would come in, and they would often tell me like, every time I come into this building, I sense all this like energy, right? It just feels very intense. And I'm just going like, oh, really? Okay. I'm like, tell me about it. They're like, yeah. And, I just like happen to see, and it's like, I don't see figures. I almost see like these orbs of light, or there's just like this like light here. And, we talked a little bit about it. And I remember in a different session, they brought it up again. And they even pointed out like, right now, I just saw this orb of light in the room and it went through you, almost like it's drawn to you. Like, and they would associate it with, you're so compassionate, you're just so caring, like that maybe they sense some type of, something was happening. And after that, we had, we were seeing each other and it would come up here and there. And in a different session, they mentioned, I came in today and I just sense a lot of pain here too, like a lot of like grief and sadness. And I just kept thinking like, oh, I'm like, okay, I'm like, what is, what does that bring up for you? And they would share, well, I used to talk to my grandma who would help people and also help transition, people that are passing on. And so she would tell me a lot about this, and it just feels very strong here. And I remember like, okay, we had that session. There were moments where I did get a little like tingle, like, like, oh my gosh. And there was a point during that year where we had a meeting at at the nonprofit, and we couldn't meet in our regular space because they were having all of these events. And so they had us go down to the basement. Now, the basement at this nonprofit, I had gone down a couple times, and it was one of those places where you walk in, you almost felt the air like leave, and it just felt very tense. And I didn't like going down there. Not only was it super quiet, but it was almost like just a very wide, long kind of space, and it just didn't feel good. And in my head, I kept thinking, whatever. Like I didn't really know a lot about the building or even the space I was working in. But remember, we went down there, and we were sitting there, and one of my coworkers casually goes, can you believe this used to be a mortuary? This is where they used to like clean the bodies. And I'm like sitting there like, oh my God, what are you talking about? He's like, yeah, this was a mortuary. And he pulls up like a article on the internet that was like, old mortuary to be converted to nonprofit. Like, I don't even know how many, it was years ago that they had converted it, but they still had an article. And I sat there and I thought about everything my client would say to me, like how it alluded to it. Like, there's so much grief here. I see like a lot of like light here. I sense every time I come in here, it just feels like a lot. And I just kept thinking like, oh my God, like that. What an interesting coincidence. I never shared this with,
Yeah.
probably should have. I didn't because I think I was trying to make sense of it myself. And I remember thinking like, this would be a place for grief, right? This would be a place where there's loss. And the way that they would describe it was very specific to it. And they didn't know about the history either. We never talked about any of that. They just kind of like would come in and like normally talk about their day and like share these things because they would come up for them. And so that was one of those moments where I remember sitting there just thinking like, oh my gosh, like they were feeling something.
That is wild. Like, sorry, that, like, my jaw just dropped. That is amazing. That is so amazing. And, I love that because I feel like, so that's a word that I use when people feel things in atmospheres is also being empathic, and then also clairsentience is like in the psychic world, that's what we call it.
Yeah.
Um, But I know that the internet, I wanted to tackle with you a couple of things that I saw on TikTok that went viral and even other social media platforms. And the top two, the first one that I saw that just floored me was when a therapist said, I hate when people, or not, he didn't say hate because that's a strong word, but he said, I greatly dislike it when people come into my sessions and talk about astrology when I spent all this time, getting my credentials, going to school, only to be like told that they know their identity based on astrology. And I was like, oh my God. And like, no offense to anyone listening, but like to me, I looked at it as like a brown Latina woman who is very spiritual. And I've been doing a lot of like just learning about like my identity as like a Latina, but also a Latina that can also navigate the world looking indigenous. Especially when I lived in Colorado, a lot of the indigenous folks were like, "Are you indigenous or Hispanic?" I'm like, "Oh, I'm Hispanic." um, so I get that. And so I spent a lot of time during this phase, and when I saw that on TikTok, I'm like, this is why I don't trust all these therapists. And the only therapist that I loved so much, Steven, if you ever hear this, Steven was a queer indigenous man, and he helped me through my traumas with actual like spirit, like, the mainstream terminology, spirit animals. But so he helped me through that, and not once did he make me feel like, oh my God, here she comes with all this stuff. Like, he empowered that. So
Mhm.
can you talk a little bit about that? Because that was a great story that you had, but also the empowerment of spirituality.
Of course, of course. I'm so glad you brought this up because I think it's so important for us to understand that this is not a one size fits all, that there are multiple explanations, multiple avenues to healing, multiple belief systems. And it's not about which one is right. I think that's something I do see a lot in the mental health field is that there is often a lot of fight against other systems and when I say systems, I'm talking about belief systems or perspectives or ideas. Instead of really understanding how these things impact and really connect to clients, they're seen as, almost something that should be dismissed, right, or ridiculed. And astrology is a huge one. I see it all the time. Fellow colleagues, even clients will say, oh, if your therapist believes in astrology, fire them. If your therapist does this, don't go to them. They're quack, and I see that all the time. And I sit there, and for me, my approach has always been, what is the significance in this person's life when it comes to these beliefs? It's not about whether I believe if it's true or not. It's about how they show up for this person as an individual in a respectful way. Because I may come in with stuff too that they might see as like ridiculous, right? I mean, I've had people who, when I share about my queerness or even the philosophy, and queerness is it's not a belief, it's a reality, right? I mean, there are queer people, and yet people dismiss it. Oh, that's not real. That's not true. That doesn't exist. And I'm sitting there like, wow, what am I? I'm right here. Your evidence. And so what
I
I'm getting
can't.
at, yeah, and I get that a lot. And so I'm laughing because this is the same thing with so many other things, right? That people are quick to dismiss. And for me, it's like, okay, astrology, like religion, it's an explanation, an understanding, a connection, it's a powerful tool for many folks. My philosophy with it whenever I talk to clients is, look, we can have all of these resources, and yet we also still have to practice accountability. We have to practice taking care of ourselves. We have to practice, all of these other things, because I always tell them it's not one or the other. Everything goes hand in hand. It's okay for you to utilize this as a tool. It helps many people. It's okay for you to believe in things because that is part of what makes us human. How is it impacting us? How is it guiding us? And also, are we using some of it as an excuse, right? And when I say that, I usually tell folks, look, my parents used to tell me all the time, Dios te va a bendecir, God's going to bless you, God's going to do this, God's going to take care of it. And I remember sitting there thinking like, wow, is it really that easy? Like I can pray to God and he's just going to handle it for me. Like, like it's done. And I remember like getting so upset with my parents and be like, Mom, like that's not how it works. God may like put these things for you, but you still got to do the work. And they wouldn't like that and be like, oh, like don't talk about God like that. Like, God's going to take care. And I just remember like challenging it so much, thinking like, okay, yeah, I'm sure God puts, things in your path. I'm sure there's like opportunities, but if you're not like actually putting like, you go work into it, it's not gonna happen. It's like I could have someone read my cards and they'll tell me like, Luis, this is gonna happen, blah blah blah. And I could be like, yeah, you know what? That is a possibility. I can be very successful, but am I going to be successful by sitting on my couch and waiting for the universe to hand it to me? Probably not. Because it's requiring for me to actually put in work and put in effort into these things. And so that's how I see it personally.
As I'm also a reader, so I do like I do one-on-one readings and I do my workshops and everything you just like in terms of like you have to go for it. Like if this is what you want, you have to chip away at it. Like even last night we had dinner with a couple of friends after our psychic circle and well, this girl was like, I went to a reader and he was so mad at me because, I didn't know this, but I said something and he got triggered like I am not I'm not a therapist and I'm not going to tell you your future. Like, I'm not going to give you shortcuts and or something along those lines. But I reinforce them like, we don't. Like, I always tell people with my sessions, like, is this your first time? Let me explain it to you because I'm not here to give you like your future set in stone. This is a
Really?
possible outcome based on the energy you're projecting,
Yeah.
but you also have to work at it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the same thing with therapy, right? And I know that people still have to go through difficult experiences and uncomfortable feelings. I know that there's people who might take medication because it might be helpful for them. People who don't. I know people who might go on a spiritual journey and that helps them. I know people who might get a limpia and that helps them. I've gotten limpia. So what I'm getting at is when we move away from black and white thinking, that is what really allows us to be more open. And I also think that's what keeps so many folks very closed off to a lot of these things, right? It's the black and white thinking that we have been given by society, right? That it's this or that, and there's never anything in between when the world really doesn't exist in that way. And I did an episode on my podcast with a paranormal researcher who had reached out to me because they loved, the fact that, well, my podcast is the Queer Magic podcast. And when we were talking, they were like, well, this is the thing that queer people are they're not closed off. They're very open to the idea that things can exist outside of
100%.
and so,
Sorry.
and so they would tell me like, I really believe that queer people have more. They didn't say susceptibility. What was the word? They have more of a channel to really connect in this way because they don't see the world in black and white. I remember reading a little bit about it, how the people that were often the ones that were conducting seances, connecting with spirits, a lot of them had queer element to themselves, right? There were people who were outcast of society. There were people who were, defying gender norms, defying sexuality. I mean, things like that that were very much innately religious, right? Because, like I said, there's going to be very differences between some of these systems.
Yeah.
And that was the first time I was exposed to that concept, that idea.
I remember through my spiritual journey. So I used to be atheist, and then like towards the end of high school and my early 20s, I was like a skeptic, non-believer, atheist. And it wasn't until I like started seeking like the psychicness, the spirituality, spiritism, that I met this indigenous woman through my high school friend, and her mom and her partner was the indigenous woman. And I always bring her up because I really greatly uh really felt seen by her and her essence. And they were my friend's mom and her partner, they're a lesbian couple for context. And it was because of them that I started this journey. And I always give thanks to that. My mentor of 10 years in the psychic circle was a gay man. So a lot of the people that I felt seen by was that. And it's interesting because in that stage, on top of that, I noticed that my friends that I had as an atheist were, mostly men and guys, and because of my ex-boyfriend and all this stuff. But then when I allowed myself to go down this journey, it was indigenous people and gay people. Like those were my friends from all of my 20s. And then it wasn't until TikTok started, I'm like, oh my God, I'm also not straight. But it took me so long to understand that. Because of like the box that I put myself in by like the biphobia and like the phobia that they instill on women and queer people in general. And then I also learned that like because I'm a fine arts major, I was going to be a teacher, and through fine arts and learning about indigenous cultures, they have the two spirit, right? Like a lot of the people that had high regard in their society, in some of these tribes, not all of them, but in some of the tribes were two spirited people, which means
Yeah.
queer people, most of the time it was somebody that expressed themselves in a very, what's the proper term I want to say?
Non-binary, or
There,
also gender. I like, for example, I identify as gender queer myself, because my gender does kind of go explore it into very different areas. Sometimes it is more masculine, sometimes more feminine, what's, those what we call those polars, and then also sometimes neither. And so I love that you said that, because this is not just in indigenous cultures here in the US. I mean, it's everywhere. There's names for it in India. There's names for it in other spaces, right? Asia, lots of places where this phenomena has existed, right? Where people do not exist within a specific concept of gender. And these are folks who are often the ones that are at the forefront, right, of pushing the arts and creativity and outside the box thinking. And and so I love that you're sharing, especially because it's Pride Month. We have to talk about the fact that, like, there are contributions in all areas by queer people, and in the paranormal, absolutely, there are lots of folks who do this work and who are able to think and see things outside the box, right? And so I think this is so interesting, because even the term two spirit, at least from my knowledge, and hopefully someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but the idea that someone is inhabited by two different spirits, right, by two different souls, that cohabit and correlate together, right, and create one individual, is such a beautiful concept, right, of how we see human and spirits and souls, and this is all embedded into everything. And
the other thing too that I wanted to bring up to you, because I mentioned, like, empathic stuff and stuff like that, and I know the internet just like went on a whole viral thing and like made fun of that terminology, something that like people in the psychic community have always used for a very long time, at least as far as I can recall. And I guess I'm curious to get your thoughts on that, because I know there's definitely like a technical term for empathy, and especially like highly sensitive empathic people on like the technicality and like in terms of like the therapy world. But then when it comes to the spiritual side of things, empath is somebody that just can feel like your client, like she felt sadness, she felt all these things. And so
yeah.
empathy translates like that, where we feel the energy there, we can sense things there from people, from locations. So can you talk a little bit about those distinctions?
It's interesting, because we are hardwired, right, for connection with each other. We are hardwired to sense people's emotions and to connect with others socially. It's part of our survival, right? When we're born and we come into this world, unless we have someone taking care of us, we don't survive, right? We're absolutely dependent on others in that sense. And so we often hear that, right? That being social is such an important part of our mental health, that understanding other people is a big part of our mental health. Therapists, most of us are obviously trained highly in being able to understand other people's emotions, right? To really tap into empathy, to really tap into that connection, because it is an essential part of the work that we do. And so when you think about it, that energy, right? I mean, we can call it whatever. I mean, there's different names, and I think that's what leaves people's heads, that as soon as they hear certain terms, there's already a bias. So if I say energy, I'm sure there's some people out there rolling their eyes, like, oh my gosh, like what do you energy, But the reality is that we can call it instincts, we can call them mirror neurons, we can call them like just emotional intelligence, but we naturally are able to connect with other people. It's why when we watch movies, right, that impact us really hard, we might cry, we might be terrified, we might feel other emotions, because we're connecting to these things. And so I mean that is a reality, right? Evolutionary wise, that is part of what helps us survive, right? Building long-lasting relationships. I mean, there's even a big talk around when we don't have that, how that affects us, right? We're talking about antisocial personality disorder. We're talking about psychopathic behaviors, right? Where people don't connect with others or have lack of empathy, right, for other people. I mean, all of these things. And so there is an awareness, right, that as social creatures, we have evolved to connect with one another. And that is what helps us survive. And when that's not there, then we have problems, right? Because then that leads to, I'm not talking about like people who are introverts, anything like that. That antisocial, is usually a lot more complex than someone, who has a very limited amount of social energy. Because yeah, and that's what I mean, right? There's going to be different terminology, different words for it. Um, but I do think that in my practice, one of the things that I've had to navigate are those intense connections and feelings, the empathy, right? That often does occur. I've had clients that have come in and are going through something very difficult, and I sense it, right? It's there. Like it almost like feels like it's shared. And it's a very interesting experience, right? To sit with a client and almost feel what they're feeling and it going into your body in that way, right? And, there was an article I read a while back about how partners, right, who are together for a long time sync together emotionally and psychologically, and how a lot of that is like, once again, going back to evolution, right? What really helps us to connect and to and to survive, right? That you feel and can understand one another, and that the reality is that not all of us are trained for this. I mean, I've spent years, and even myself, still being human, I'm not perfect, and so there's going to be
Yeah.
a lot which where even it's challenging. But we're in general as a population, we're often not trained on emotions, and so when you think about that sense of the emotion and the cognitive, we are wired to experience these things for a reason. They actually serve a purpose. Even when we think of sadness, right? I most of the time I hear people say, "I don't like sadness. I don't want to feel sadness. Get rid of my sadness." And I tell them, no, and most of us have seen Inside Out. Sadness serves a purpose, right? There's a reason for it being there, and at the same time, it doesn't mean that it's comfortable. It's very uncomfortable, right? We're so used to the feel good feelings, right? The happy, the excited, the joy, because we don't have to really deal with them, right? And they're acceptable. People want us to be happy. And as soon as we switch to these other emotions that are more complex as well, they're dismissed, right? Like I don't like I remember hearing people say, I don't like to watch other people cry. Like it makes me just feel so uncomfortable. And it's because we were often told, stop crying. You don't, stop showing that emotion. It's weakness. And so we associate it with it. And so that's my point, getting back to like all of this, even with understanding the paranormal and spirituality, that we do have in our body ways of sensing certain emotions, right? Certain feelings, certain energy, because our body picks up on it.
I love that. Can you talk to me more about the first time you had a tarot card reading or a limpia or anything like that?
Grew up in religion. I thought getting your cards read meant you're going to go to hell. So the first time I ever got it read with my partner years ago, I had so much guilt and shame around sitting in that room with this woman who was reading my card, because I thought, oh shit, like that's it. Like mortal sin, I committed this. And then realized, a lot of what she was sharing with me was so interesting because it wasn't magical. It wasn't like, you're gonna, wake up tomorrow. It was usually, it was stuff that was very like, well, this is something I'm seeing. You might be going through a difficult. Yeah, I am. This is something that might help you. And so a lot of it was reasonable stuff. It was stuff that was like, okay, you know what? Of course, if I put work into this, if I do this, if it just felt very different than what I had been explained, that, they were gonna like. And I don't know if you see that new movie too, Tarot. It's that movie that's out. Oh my God.
The podcast just came out on that. We did a whole review on that.
That is how I pictured that the cards. I was like, as soon as they read my cards, I'm gonna have some like bruja, popping in it, trying to take me away or whatever. And it wasn't even like that. I remember the first time I did Olympia for myself, I was going through so much, and I was like, you know what? Like, this is something that I was taught about, but because my parents were so religious, they said it was a negative thing. And yet I learned that it was a practice that was very much done in Guatemala and Mexico. And so I remember going to very, very intentional. I found someone that was Guatemalan. I found someone that was indigenous. I found someone that, spoke with me before we went through all the steps. And I had the Lipia with them. And I have to say that it was one of the most powerful experiences I had ever had. Then I remember walking out of there and just feeling this sense of relief. And did it get rid of my problem? No. What it did was that it made me feel like all of this heavy energy, all of this like stuff that's even, we can even talk about it chemically, right? The brain releases stress hormones. It releases, all of these different chemicals that translate into what we call, the energy or the heavy stuff. The point was, it released it. And I was able to go on and like really address these things in a way that made me feel more secure, but also not having to feel this heaviness on me. And so, like I was saying, there's tons of different explanations. There's tons of different tools that people use. And even that, that idea of Olympia, I think we all come in with these concepts of some magical thinking when a lot of it's not really magical. I mean, even when you think of paranormal, it's not magic. It's really the idea that us as humans, we don't even know where we go after we die. We don't even know. Like, we have all types of theories. We have all types of ideas. The whole point of it is that it exists outside of our perception and our structured way of thinking, right? Not logical.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I know we went a little time, but I wanted to, you touched base on so many wonderful things, and I feel like we'll have to have you come back on because it's just so many wonderful things. But with that being said, like, speaking of like just the misconceptions and the nuances and just this very absolutist black and white mentality thinking, I think before we wrap up and conclude here, what are the things that people should look for if they are into the paranormal, they are spiritual, they are doing magical things, if for lack of word, what should they seek out in a therapist before booking one? Because I think that's a hot topic as well.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Many therapists have consultations that they provide. And I know that there's so much anxiety around even bringing it up. Like I said, shame and stigma. I didn't get to share my story about with my therapist, but what I will say about it, at least in that regard, is that it made a huge difference that my therapist didn't outright say, that's not real, that's not true. But instead, it was really curious and actually explored it with me and gave me tools that were not meant to be solutions, right? But were meant to help me challenge whatever was happening. And even till this point, I don't know if it was in the spiritual realm or if it was psychological in that sense, what I worked with a specific therapist on. But I do know that that validation, that support, and that opportunity to process and talk about it really helped me a lot. And I don't believe that they're exclusive. I don't believe that, oh my gosh, this is what got rid of, like, the bad thing. I believe that they're interconnected. That, many people, even through history, have explained mental health illnesses and challenges as demons. I mean, we still hear that today. People still say, "Oh, my demons that plague me," right? Or when someone, dies by suicide, they'll talk about, "Oh, they had demons," right? Because we still have these associations and connections between them because these were unexplained. And just because we have a formal medical model, right? I mean, even mental health, I will be transparent. It's not a direct science, right? It's a social science. This is based on research, yes, but a lot of it we have to understand. It's not clear cut, right? We have to assess. We have to be very careful of the way that we engage with people. We have to be very conscious culturally and understand diversity. I mean, it's not easy work. And so what I say to people is find a therapist that's doing that work. You can ask them, you can talk to them, right? We can, I mean, the whole point of finding someone is to be transparent and honest. Therapists are bound by confidentiality, and even in consultation, they're not going to disclose this. And if they do, you have lots of opportunities to make sure that they're held accountable for it. So my point is, don't be afraid to talk about it. If you're coming in with this concept of, this is the part of my life that is very big, share it with them. I've actually seen a lot more collaboration between folks who work in the spiritual realm and therapists, collaborating a lot more and being, able to refer clients to one another, because there's obviously different focuses, different elements to the work. And so I've seen that a lot more. So you can also ask someone that maybe has more spirituality, or someone that, is in your community, if they know anyone, because they might. The other thing is also moving away from the black and white thinking, right? I'm either crazy or I'm not, but seeing it more as what is, I'm experiencing something, that much I know. My goal is not to define it, it's to understand it more so that I can take the necessary steps to address it. Like I said, there are going to be some folks who are experiencing a mental illness, and that is chemical, that is, whatever, but we don't just jump to that conclusion, right? It takes time. And there's going to be other folks who do have that very sensitive connection, right? And even in that realm, like, I've often had conversations with colleagues, like, when we talk about schizophrenia, we have to understand that humans are so complex and so powerful that sometimes I wonder, is there something more to that, right? Are people, maybe speaking in a different plane of existence, a different universe, a different something. I mean, there's so many, even scientists that have looked into this. The universe is so intense and scary to be honest. We don't even know what's in the oceans, to be quite honest. So,
I know.
I mean, we don't know. So, my point in being is move away from the idea of crazy, not crazy, and instead really think about what is this that's showing up for me? How do I explain it? How would I like to, talk about this? And what do I actually need? Right? Because even with therapy, right, we set goals, we set contests right around even like understanding this. I got clients who come in and said, I just want to understand more about it. And we're like, okay, let's talk about it. What are some things you haven't shared that have really felt like you had to carry alone? Talk about it openly.
All right. Well, thank you so much. There's just so many good information, so many points that you touched on. And I know that this is like, obviously, like for the month of June, going to be definitely like one of my top favorites because we talked on so many amazing, important topics. Where can people find you?
Yeah, so I am on social media on Instagram. That's the main platform I use, where I share a lot of my content, updates, events that I'm a part of. And that is at Luis, Luis underscore the THEE _LMFT. My website is www.luis-cornejo.com. And then my private practice is www.psychosocialtherapy.com. And I do see clients virtually in California. Uh,
Mhm.
like I said, I specialize in queer and BIPOC mental health. So if someone out there, happens to need a therapist or is interested, you can always go to my website and learn about how to contact me through there. And then the other one, the Luis Cornejo one, is more about my other work modeling podcast. You can find everything on there.
I love that. Well, and I'm going to put all that in the description too, so people know where to find you. Okay, remember everybody, stay strange.
Strange.
Woo!